you, Mike. Okay, let me hit another button here. We're off and going. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to your group. I've been at this a long time, as someone said, introducing me. I've come to the point of view that one of the things that we are really missing in this world, and we have been missing a long time, of course, is the idea of what nutrition is and how to use it. I really want to do, I want to talk about one particular aspect of this question that's been so difficult to sort of, in a sense, digest. I hate to use that word, but it's one particular aspect of this story that really has been a real difficult hoop to jump through. It has to do with dietary protein. Basically, let me go back and point out that this story really relates to a lot of existential problems we have today, big problems. Let's start out with the idea first off that in the United States is number one in the world in terms of healthcare spending, dollars per capita. That's not a very enviable position to be in. You think we have the best results then as a result. But at the same time that that is occurring, we spend the most, number one in the world, the most for pharmaceuticals in dollars per capita. And then in addition, we're the only country in the world who advertises TV prescription drugs. So it's not surprising we spend so much. We advertise them and so forth. And now, one other shocker, to be honest about it, prescription drug side effects. It's already been, this has been known for, gosh, 10, 15 years or so. Prescription drug side effects is the number 3 cause of death. Some say number 4, depending on how you rank things. But in any case, prescription drug side effects is the number 3 cause of death. So here we are spending all the money to get healthy by using drugs on one hand, yet on the other hand, these drugs themselves causes side effects, deaths, in fact. In terms of life expectancy, we're down the list among countries, the so-called Western countries, the sort of economically developed countries. We're way down the list. So here we are spending all this money on drugs and supposed to get something good out of it, but we're way down the list in terms of life expectancy. Among these countries, for those of us who are, let's say, more than 65, I mean, from birth, our average life expectancy is about 76.9 years. We're dead last among Western countries. So let me turn your attention now to another thought. Namely, I just mentioned, of course, some of the personal health problems that we presently have, a shorter life, healthcare costs, et cetera. On the right, you can see. The other thing that we have to now concern ourselves with as well is the environmental question. We know about climate warming. Maybe we know about depleted topsoil that gets washed down the river, Mississippi River, in particular into the Gulf of Mexico. We see a loss of deep water aquifers. You can see that in California at the present time, loss of species. We got a bunch of problems. And so we have all these items here, and I can put some more. I just listed these among them. It tends to be that individuals tend to work in one of these areas, not necessarily others. And we tend to assume because of that, because of our working in silos, so to speak, we tend to assume that each of these items have independent causes. I'm going to suggest there's one cause. Just think about that. I mean, some of the really big problems we have in the society today, I'm working through the idea that a lot of these things, of course, most of them listed here, are related to, let's say, a single cause. Here's my recommendation, namely, the cause is not eating the right food. It's that simple. And I have, of course, been in the laboratory for many, many years. I also was deeply involved in national policy development for many of those years as well. So I've seen the story from the lab to the lecture hall to, let's say, the policy boardrooms, in a sense, making policy. And looking at this whole thing, it's an obviously extremely complex issue when we think about all the different parts, from the science to its application, and so forth and so on. But I've been able to, in my mind at least, narrow all of this complexity down to two things. Number one, eat plants. Eat plants, not animals. And secondly, and that's the topic of my lecture today is, what about this question not about not eating animals? The second thing that I would like for you to consider is just eating whole food. In a way, that doesn't mean we can't chop it up, we can't cook it. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about eating food with all of its contents more or less together, and so we can consume all those nutrients. So Mother Nature, when she has a look at what we ate, she knows what to do with it when it gets into our system. Now, another point here to keep in mind as I go through this, it turns out that on average, as we increase animal food consumption, we tend to decrease plant food consumption. So a lot of the data that one sees compares societies or groups of people, whether they're eating animal food or something in animal food versus something in plant food. Keep in mind that usually those correlations, if you will, represent two sort of effects. One having to do with, let's say, on the one hand, increasing animal food, which is associated with decreasing plant food, both doing the same things. Both of those movements ended up doing the same thing. Now, here's what we grew up on, and we have, and unfortunately, many of us in the world today aspire to eat this kind of food here. And I'm going to suggest that without dwelling on this topic, you already know so well, that there's one nutrient. There's one nutrient, actually, either subconsciously or consciously, that drives our choices of food in that direction over the years. And that one nutrient has been animal-based protein, which is called high quality, by the way. So we can't seem to get away from it. Yep, if we question, pardon?
You lower your camera. You guys lower your camera. There you go.
Okay, I've got the arrangement here kind of strange, but anyhow, if we, is that okay, Mike? Okay, so in any case, I've been working in this area for, as I say, all these years, and I've come to know that anyone who dares to question this reverence, if you will, for protein, it's difficult. Basically, so let's say your reputation is gone. Here's the state of affairs today in terms of how we revere this so-called nutrient, animal protein. I mean, you can see these pictures, you know them as well as I do. Agriculture has turned into a massive industry, as you know. Most food now being produced is produced on factory farms, not the small family farms. And here's something really kind of odd. Even though we're beginning to understand that this is a problem, eating all this animal food, if one just checks online and have a look for yourself, you can see that the discussion is not so much that we maybe should be slowing down eating these foods. The major discussions occurring worldwide is how do we meet the demand for more consumption of these foods? So we got a big challenge in front of us. Now, let me bring myself into this story here a little bit. Some of you, of course, may have heard this. I started on a dairy farm, milking cows, and finally went away to school and did a doctoral dissertation at Cornell University, encouraging the consumption of animal protein. That's the title of it there. I won't get into those details. And then thereafter, my first academic position at Virginia Tech in Blacksburg, Virginia, I was assigned the responsibility of coordinating a program in feeding malnourished children in the Philippines, a State Department program. And of course, when I went to the Philippines, we tended to believe, as most of us do in nutrition, that these kids who are nourished and even starving, the biggest problem they have is they're not getting enough protein. So far, coming from the farm, I'm producing and participating in the production of edible protein, if you will, not thinking much about it, obviously. But then in graduate school, doing a doctoral dissertation, in a sense, pushing for the production of more animal protein in a more convenient way. And then thirdly, in this case here, coming to be told that starving malnourished children in the world, more than anything, need protein. It was about that time, though, and this is late 1960s, it was about that time that I came to learn of a study from India, a kind of obscure, a relatively obscure journal in those days, a study from India in rats, in this particular case, showing that when these animals were fed different levels of protein to see what effect it had on liver cancer. That's what I thought I saw in the children, by the way. I thought I saw the children consuming the most protein, fewer number, were coming from families that were more likely to be consuming more animal-based food like we do in the West, or animal protein, let's call it. In any case, this study here in India, experimental animal studies, sort of added to my concern, namely, animals given, all these animals are getting liver cancer, if you will, but animals given the higher levels of protein, which the researchers thought would actually decrease the risk of getting liver cancer, those fed the higher levels, 20% of total calories, that's more or less a regular level, they're the ones that got the cancer. The animals fed the lower levels of protein in this particular case, and it was animal protein, none did. That was pretty spectacular. That 100-0 score is something to take notice of. And of course, that came at a time when I was in the Philippines working on this question concerning these kids getting more protein. That gave me pause because it suggested maybe eating protein increases cancer. So I obviously came home, organized a research study at my university that then continued for the next 27 years. That particular project did. Was funded by the National Institutes of Health, all public money. And I wanted to show you just one representation of some of the results that we saw that was kind of spectacular. I mean, mind you, I'm coming from the background I just mentioned. I'm finding it a little bit difficult to believe that animal protein might have this effect of actually turning on cancer. So that was the basis for it. I started this program, and you can see here, I'm just showing one representation of the kind of results we got. This is basically the development of cancer shown on the y-axis, if you will, over the first 12 weeks from the time that the cancer first starts from a mutation. Okay, let's see what we see. The animals given the 20% of protein, that's what the Indian workers have done. The cancer is really growing quite well, no problem there. The animals given 5%, the cancer is not growing. That was pretty spectacular and was in agreement with what I thought I was seeing, in the children and what I had thought I was seeing in the Indian work as well. Then we looked at this question in many different ways. I had lots of students, they were all doing theses and so forth, but we looked at this in many different ways over the years. And I want to just show you one representation that really catches your attention, caught mine for sure. During those first 12 weeks, I decided let's switch to dietary protein. Let's give them 20% first for weeks the cancers are growing, as you can see there. Switch them to 5%, turn it on, turn it off. 20% back on again, 20% off. I have to say that's pretty spectacular. And that really got me to thinking, hey, maybe I was wrong. My assumptions were wrong about the animal protein effect. This is for real. When we can turn on experimental cancer development simply by adjusting the level of animal protein, that's pretty spectacular in my mind. This also addressed a broader question at the time that I was even more spectacular in a sense. It suggests that nutrition rather than genes controls cancer development. I mean, most of us in those days, and unfortunately still most people these days, tend to assume that cancer is a genetic disease, starts with genes, mutations, if you will. And nutrition doesn't have that much to do with it. In this representation here that we developed in the late 1970s and early 1980s shows that we could turn on cancer and off, turn it on and off simply by adjusting the nutrient intake, keeping the genetic background the same starting place. Now, it turns out that a little bit later, and still another study, we learned too that the protein we were using was cow's milk protein of all things. That's what turned cancer on. But we turned our attention to the question whether or not plant proteins would have the same effect, and they did not. We tested specifically soy and wheat protein in fairly elegant studies, and we found out that these plant proteins did not increase cancer development, even when they were fed at a higher level of 20%. So here's another big idea, at least for me at the time, there was a big idea. The animal proteins are turning on the cancer, causing the cancer to grow. Plant proteins are not. I mean, really sharply distinctive difference. That led to yet another question that I sort of wondered about at the time. animal proteins causing cancer is one thing, but what about animal protein causing other diseases as well? Two, what about the possibility that plant proteins might have a similar opposite effect, if you will? So at this point in time, with this rather spectacular result coming on board, I'm getting a lot of pushback from colleagues that told me, don't go there, this is crazy, or you'll get in trouble, et cetera, et cetera. One of the things we have to do in our research like that, and at that time I was in the sort of pharmacology community more than even the nutrition community. One of the things we do when we see a result like this, that's pretty hard to accept, if you will, is to know how does it work. So we started looking for the biological mechanism explaining that protein effect. And I was interested, as everyone would be in those days, in this kind of research. I wanted to find out what the mechanism is, the biochemical mechanism, if you will. I wanted to see if we could identify the mechanism that allowed this protein to have that kind of effect. Because if we could identify the mechanism, then of course, so the story goes, we might be able to have a drug to block that mechanism, if you will, and keep on eating the food that we do. So we started looking for mechanisms. And I want to just summarize for you work of about 12 to 15 years, actually, as I went through this process. And when I just first draw your attention to the way we studied cancer in those days from the research point of view, we considered cancer to be to have 3 stages. Initiation, that's when the cancer is first forming as a result of mutation. And then after that, some of these cells kind of hang around and now have the potential to cause cancer. So they start dividing. That's promotion. And so it goes. Finally, the cancer, after time, reaches a point when, in case of humans, of course, we notice something's wrong. We go get diagnosed. We get diagnosed with cancer. And now it's becoming a little more serious because those cancer cells have by this time metastasized to other tissues. So those are the 3 stages, more or less, just schematically representations of thinking about this: initiation, promotion, and progression. In the first instance, I wanted to see if we could identify the mechanism in the first stage to account for this protein effect. We started looking for things like, for example, we learned that a higher protein increases the rate of the so-called chemical carcinogen into the cell. It increases the transfer of the carcinogen into the cell. This is a very elaborate sort of process, but nonetheless, that's what a high protein did. We went on, when the cells go, when the carcinogen gets inside the cell, conventionally, the carcinogen is metabolized by an enzyme called mixed function oxidase. It's metabolized to a product that is less toxic and we get rid of it. But some of it it produces a product that's very, very reactive. That is so reactive it binds to the DNA or genes, if you will. In any case, that's a shorthand. I tried to describe that. What we found was that the high protein diet increases that enzyme activity to produce more of that highly reactive chemical carcinogen. In turn, that carcinogen, then we found that the high protein diet increased the binding of that carcinogen to the DNA. Lo and behold, and that's the beginning of a mutation, if you will. But then we saw something else. We have normally in our cells the ability to correct that kind of problem, which is occurring more or less all the time with various carcinogens. We have a thing called DNA repair. And that's a good thing. The higher that is, the better. But we found out in this particular case here, as the animal protein intake goes up and more of the carcinogens bind to the DNA, what happens, the animal protein does this really rather strange thing. It decreases our ability to repair the problem. So here's the animal protein turning it on and then compromising the ability we have to turn it off. So then we went to the second stage. I'm still looking for the key mechanism, if you will, by this time. I go to the second stage, as you can see, and I put double arrows here, you'll notice. Over time, I learned, of course, that we could turn cancer on and off, as I just showed you. We looked for the so-called mechanism there too. And once again, we looked for a bunch of mechanisms, and here's what we found. I mean, each one of these mechanisms, I must tell you, usually occupied a doctoral dissertation, and it took 2 or 3 years to really work it out. But in any case, the high protein diet in the second stage here also turned off something else that was good. It decreased so-called natural killer cell activity. T cells, we call them these days, natural killer cell activity. This was done, God, 35 years ago now. In any case, the high protein diet turned off this good thing. Natural killer cells are produced from the immune system, so to speak, to take care of cancer cells and kill them straight off, right up front. So the animal protein diet actually decreased natural killer cell activity, or these so-called T cells. And it did some other things. I won't go into the details here. It increased the rate at which these cancer cells divide. It increased the production of sort of these reactive oxygen species or oxygen radicals. It increased the hormone that causes cells to divide, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I know there's a lot of chemistry for a lot of you folks, but let me tell you, this is really important because what I'm having to learn in this process that, I had been on the wrong track about animal protein myself early on. So I really wanted to work this thing right down to the basic level. And all these mechanisms, I'm sure there's many more, but after some time, I was able to summarize these effects, and come to think of it, it turned out that 8 of these mechanisms were increased by high animal protein. That's turning cancer on, right? 2 of these mechanisms were decreased when increased animal protein. So 8 of them are increased, 2 of them are decreased, no exceptions. Everything we looked at just fit this picture. And it turns out that all 10, however, worked in unison actually to increase cancer. So the question arises, which one of these are we going to pick out to maybe develop a drug, like a statin drug maybe? Which one of these mechanisms are going to pick out that we might sort of consume a drug along with it so we can continue to eat our animal protein? And what was really remarkable about this too, I thought, was that nutrients don't come in one at a time into our body and go to the cell one at a time. It doesn't do that. It goes there, but there's many nutrients working together, all coming at the same time. And here's what really happens inside the cell. And I won't go into this in this lecture. Here's a separate lecture. It's really fascinating, but it turns out these cells come into the cell and also operate in unison. It's almost like a symphony. It's almost, it begs the question, who's directing traffic here? I mean, it's a very complex situation, not just 10 mechanisms, probably 100, 1,000, I don't know, all working together, however you want to count them. The amazing thing about this from my perspective was that somehow some kind of force was existing in these cells to cause them to all work in unison when we consume more animal protein. So as far as proven to cause and effect is concerned, there's no doubt in my mind. Animal protein turns on cancer, period. And we couldn't come up with a singular mechanism. And I thought, well, there's no such thing as thinking like that. Generally no single mechanism, but sometimes we think we found a single mechanism, make a drug for it, but that's going to be problematic and it's part of another lecture. But in any case, the protein, animal protein, like other nutrients, they come in and so create a whole crescendo of metabolites and mechanisms and so forth and so on. Quite frankly, kind of working together to produce the effect. It's not to think about this. Isn't that pretty impressive? The animal protein, I'm showing it with animal protein, but in turn, animal protein tends to be a driver of dietary choice, as I mentioned before. Now, let me show you here, going forward here, some data that was undertaken by other researchers over the years. And I recently got a chance to go back and fetch these slides and present them as screenshots just here, just as they were. So I'm not rearranging things. The only thing I did with this slide here, for example, I drew a regression line through it. And there's a way to do that with leaving all the numbers in place. And it turned out this regression line is pretty straight, as you can see. And these are all the different countries, if you will. Here's US right here for, in this case, kidney cancer. Renal cancer is kidney cancer. So what these researchers found, and I think it's like 35 years ago, I believe now, when that was published, what they found was we compare a bunch of countries in respect to how much kidney cancer, what's the incidence of kidney cancer. They plotted that against animal protein consumption. That's pretty remarkable. The higher the animal protein consumption, the higher the risk of kidney cancer. I mean, one cannot argue that somebody else is going to come along and find the opposite. That line is not going to go the other way. There it is. higher animal protein consumption is going to give rise to more liver cancer. And keep in mind, is one thing I mentioned before, animal protein goes up, that's representing the collective effect, not just of the animal protein itself, but also the effect of a decrease in plant protein or plant foods. Here's another one. This was published in 1959 by a man named Majalov. I happen to have known him when I was a young student at the time. What he showed was that an increase in animal protein here on the x-axis increases the risk of coronary heart disease deaths, that's CHD mortality. Again, I went back and got his chart, put it here as a screenshot, put it through a line, and see that straight line? It's more the same thing as the kidney cancer. Kidney cancer incidence, heart disease deaths. Here's another one. In this case here, this is prostate cancer. This is more recent. A researcher here had actually found that as non-fat milk consumption has increased, prostate cancer risk goes up for all these different countries. That's a bunch of different countries there. So increase in consumption of non-fat milk, increase in prostate cancer. What's non-fat milk? Well, quite frankly, it's a protein drink because there's nothing much left. Non-fat, you take out the fat, the main thing that's left behind is the protein, animal protein. So, and once again, increase in the non-fat milk, increase prostate cancer. Here's another one done by a friend of mine from Canada. Namely, he was looking at the relationship for breast cancer for different countries. Here's the US up here near the top. The relationship between breast cancer on the y-axis, if you will, relative to the intake of saturated fat. Saturated fat mostly is found in animal food, as you probably know. So this kind of stood out. Saturated fat, as the intake is increased, breast cancer risk goes up. And again, it's a pretty straight line. I'll show you what it was for unsaturated fat coming from plant foods in a moment. But here we got 4 things already with straight regression lines showing increasing things that indicate animal protein, all these diseases. Here's something, this has been flipped on the XY axis. The cholesterol intake is coming from our food, and cholesterol comes from animal food, as you know. As we increase cholesterol intake for these different countries, this is yet another research. As we increase cholesterol intake for these different countries, the death rate for heart disease goes up, similar to what the other fellow found with animal protein. But in this case, he's talking about cholesterol, okay? This kind of plot here, this representation here, is really gets people exercised about not eating cholesterol, which I have to say is a very, very simplistic view, quite frankly. Cholesterol comes from animal foods, of course, but if we just deal with that alone, that's not going to solve the problem. So here's yet another one. Meat consumption increases colon cancer incidence. Okay, same thing. I mean, we all know what meat is. Meat is obviously a primary source of animal protein, if you will. Here's one for uterine cancer. In this case, these researchers, incidentally, every one of these charts I was showing was a different research group. And they published their stuff, 30, 40 years ago or so. And I just went back and happened to collect from the publications these charts. And then all of a sudden realized that they're all saying the same sort of thing in a sense. Drew some lines on them. And once again, all these charts I just showed you, here's the 7th one already, the straight line relationship. Now, the one thing we can say about all of this, one of them concerns meat, the other concerns total fat, another one cholesterol, one skim milk, some animal protein, so forth and so on. What this suggested to those researchers at that time was fairly narrowly focused. It suggested, don't consume skim milk or don't consume low-fat milk because you might get prostate cancer for men, of course. Be careful, don't consume, let's say, cholesterol, you might get heart disease. I'm saying that kind of narrow, myopic, that's myopic kind of thinking. It's narrowly focused kinds of thinking, just thinking of one thing at a time like that. We've missed the big story. So here's a sort of summary of what I just said. Cholesterol intake, meat intake, total fat intake, all of these that I just showed you, these charts, they are what I would call animal protein surrogates. They're all representing the same thing. That's one point. The other thing is these regression lines that you see here, they come down to very close to zero. What does that say? In theory, it suggests that as soon as we start putting in animal protein in our bodies, animal food, if you will, the risk of these diseases starts to go up more for some folks than other folks, but nonetheless, that's where the risk starts. The moment you put in any animal food protein in the diet. Now, as I said before, I was going to show you the one for unsaturated fat or plant protein, if you will. I showed that plot right here. This is the same gentleman from Canada who did the one for saturated fat. This is, he called it unsaturated fat. I stuck plant protein right in there myself. And you see there's no relationship. See, that turns out to be the same thing I'm seeing in the laboratory with the animals. The animal protein increases the disease risk, not just for cancer, for these other diseases too. Plant protein doesn't have any relationship. That's a pretty big deal to add to the mechanisms that we have. So it raises another question. Now, I really want to focus your attention on this question of protein. How come we have worshipped this protein as if it's something really special and we're going to get our meat no matter what? Because most people think that protein is only found in meat, at least they used to. We know it's in plants too now, of course, but in any case, that was what subconsciously drove societies and people around the world got to have some meat. If they've thought about any justification for consumption, that's where I get my protein from, okay? So I went back and had some time here to have a look at this question. Where did this worship, if you will, this reverence come from for protein? It was, I spent a year at Oxford University with my colleague working on the China studies at the time, and I spent some time in the library to go and see what I could find. And here's a gentleman here. I didn't find this. There was another researcher published in 1937 who brought me on, called my attention to this, but nonetheless, the man who first discovered protein, his name is Gerhard Mulder, a Dutch chemist, if you will, in 1839. He was actually doing some experiments with dogs and found out that dogs were eating meat, and if he took the meat away, they would die or they get sick or so forth. And so he realized that the dogs had to have meat to survive. Keep in mind, this is 1839, this is a long time ago. So he decided to look in the meat to see if he could find something, chemically speaking, that might account for that. And so he discovered a chemical. He isolated it, found a chemical, and had to give it a name. He gave it the name protein. Why? It turns out, this is really interesting. He gave the name protein after the Greek word proteos, meaning of prime importance. And I just want to step aside for a moment, just mention to you, just last week, I spoke for the second time to a colleague of mine, an economics professor in Greece, who's organizing some big efforts to get people to change their diets. But in any case, she's in Greece, and I told her about this thing and kind of checked it out with her, the name protein. She said the word proteos in Greek means first, okay? I had meaning of prime importance, but it means first. So here, this strange new chemical coming out and said, wow, this is what keeps these dogs alive. Give it a name. We give it a name protein first. Right there from the birth or baptism of this chemical, from there on, we worship practically this protein. It was always the prime thing. We got to have it. When plant protein was discovered a few years later, 2 decades later, actually, it was sort of pushed aside because it didn't have the same value. And I'll come back to that in a moment. In any case, why did he say that? So here's the question I want to bring your attention to. Why do we think that animal protein is high quality? Plant protein, low quality. I mean, even those folks, or all you folks in the vegetarian vegan communities, you somehow in the back of your minds, you probably have heard, you don't necessarily believe it, but you kind of had heard animal protein is high quality. That's really what has dominated our thinking, as I say, consciously, unconsciously for decades. Here's what high quality means. This is a question I actually was dealing with to some extent, specifically in my doctoral dissertation back in the 1950s. High quality technically means this. High quality protein means more of the protein in a test system, for a period of time. We determine this. We find out that the protein that it's a proportion of protein retained in the body. And we just call it high quality. Because if protein is not good, then if we can retain more, then we call it high quality. It's actually in the nutritional science sense, it's called biological value. So as we increase, as certain proteins have high quality, others don't. Well, that's been examined. I won't show you the slides here, but it turns out all the animal proteins are basically in a class by themselves, high quality. All the plant proteins, in contrast, are low quality, and no overlap, by the way. And so, everybody likes to have quality, right? We call it quality and so forth and so on. This was developed in 1924, nearly 100 years ago now, by research at University of Illinois. So this stuck with us. Animal protein is high quality. It's the only kind of protein we should consume, so many people believe. Okay, keep that in mind just for a moment. So animal proteins, higher retention, more protein retains, high quality plant protein. Okay, there you go. This researcher did this is H.H. Mitchell, professor at the University of Illinois. He published there, as you can see, it says a method for determining biological value of protein, which is kind of interesting. Meaning more protein is retained. And what he liked that idea, and others did too, because they wanted to believe animal protein was good anyhow. If animals consume more of the animal protein, their body weight gain is faster. That's a pretty good deal. I mean, that looks impressive, especially impressive for livestock production. So you feed some animal protein to certain kinds of like pigs or chicken, whatever. They produce more, they get bigger, faster, etc. So it's a commercial initiative, basically. So high quality protein is important. And then it was just generally assumed this is good for humans too. It makes us grow faster. Actually, I don't have a chance to get into that question here. In the case of humans, it's not a good idea. The rate of growth will be of its own, grow at its own pace. If we're consuming plant-based diets, it will be a little bit slower, hardly noticeable, it'll be a little bit slower, but that's the way nature has it, and everything else goes along with it in a good way. So pushing the fastest rate of growth is not the best way to go. Nonetheless, we want to eat high quality protein to get that faster rate of growth. Okay, what does retaining more protein mean? What does retaining more protein mean? Because the higher the percent of protein retained, the higher the quality. Okay, let's look at something else here. Here's something else that we now know, but my colleagues refuse to acknowledge it. Namely, high protein, animal protein, if you will. Okay, they still call it high quality, if you will. People even trying to, people in the plant protein business are trying to emulate the high quality of animal protein, which is kind of silly. But in any case, when protein more is retained as an animal protein, here's some things that now we know occurs. And several of these are things we discovered ourselves. Animal protein increases growth hormone. Do we want to retain more protein to create more growth hormone, create cancer, and do some other things? It increases blood estrogen. It increases, I mentioned before, the production of so-called free radicals that increase aging and cancer. It increases cancer mutations, but it decreases these natural killer cells, the T cells, okay? And it decreases these two things that we have working for us, all of which increase cancer. So the high quality protein, more being retained, that's called higher biological value. Everybody's excited about it. Okay, I'm going to get that, but they don't know this. They don't know this. That's increasing cancer. Higher quality protein also increases the synthesis of total cholesterol and LDL cholesterol. That's the bad kind of cholesterol, which in turn is associated with the increase in heart disease. High quality protein does something else, rather indirectly, but high quality protein in those kind of diets increase blood sugar. And A1C, the sort of metrics or the labs that are used to assess risk for diabetes. So here it is. The protein is high quality, all animal protein. The protein is higher quality is doing all these things too. Is anyone paying attention to this? No. This has been around now for 30, 40 years. And none of my colleagues are really paying any attention to this. And it sort of raised a question. We're living in I don't know what we're living in. It's some kind of cage. We can't seem to open our minds to think about possibilities that is generally not known to see what is possible. But I don't think retaining protein, that metric, retaining higher proportion protein being retained, is a very good idea, and I think you would probably agree. One more thing to carry forward. I want to show you really quickly. This worship of protein continues today. What I'm showing here is that now we're going to just change your thinking a bit. I'm going to talk about the protein being recommended and what an impact that's had on the way we think about protein. This is just a sort of a spread of different levels of protein intake. 5 to 6% of a diet in protein fed at a level of 5 to 6% of total calories. That's the minimum amount of protein we need. That was determined in 1943 and been repeated many times since. But in any case, that's the amount of protein we need. We all need protein, important nutrient. But we increased it by a couple of standard deviations, statistical manipulations, just to make sure everybody gets enough protein. So this became known as a recommended dietary allowance, recommended daily allowance, recommended daily intake, if you will. So around 9 to 10% protein is all the protein that almost everyone needs. Okay, but what do? We've been, as a society, as the United States, the range of protein intake we consume has been somewhat between 11, 22, 23% or so. It's incredible. So we're all eating this protein here when we only need that. And we do that because, and 75 to 80% of that is of that total protein is animal based. That's what's driving the narrative. That's what's driving our thoughts. We think we need more protein, all coming from that idea, this protein from animals, good, high quality, etc. And so we load up on it. We end up on average in our American diet, 70 to 80% or so of our total protein intake is from animal sources. So we're living here in this range. Here's where we live in, above what we need. Now I'm going to superimpose these charts I showed before, these lines here. Let's superimpose that right here. Here's where those lines more or less go, right here. As we increase protein intake, mostly from animal foods in our society, as we increase that, guess what? We increase the risk for all these different diseases. That's inarguable. That's inarguable. There's no way someone's going to come along and say, oh, you're wrong. I'm going to show you something different. It can't be that way. There's no way that these kind of data can show up and ever be refuted. So one more comment in passing. The whole food plant-based diet provides enough protein, by the way. That's all we need. We do not need any more protein than what is provided by a plant-based diet, a whole food plant-based diet. Now, plants, a whole food plant-based diet, we actually can increase protein intake. We like legumes and stuff like that if we want to. We can get the level of protein up around 15, maybe even close to 20%. Don't worry about it. That's not a problem because that plant protein is good. It's not bad, number one. Number two, when it comes to plants, we're eating all the good stuff anyhow, so that's not an issue. So the main point is plant-based diets, whole food plant-based diets provide all the protein we need. There's no justification whatsoever for consuming animal protein. Recently in 2000, the dietary guidelines first created in 1980. There's a couple of friends of mine actually did that in office next to me when I was on sabbatic, but in any case, I followed it very closely from 1980 onwards. And the dietary guidelines are adjusted every 5 years and they come out, make big news when they come out. Well, in 2000, it was a little late that year, it was 2002 actually, the Institute of Medicine, the National Academy of Science, who determines these numbers, they came up with the idea of let's set an upper limit for different nutrients. The other ones determining minimum intake, they determine things like minimum requirement, RDA, stuff like that. They came up with the idea, let's set an upper limit. So they set an upper limit of all things, upper safe limit, that was the point, for protein, 35%. That is mindless. And it turned out, I know some of the people on the committee, I called a couple of them up, I've been on this committees myself, and I said, what in the world are you doing? A couple of them said they didn't know they had done that. The committee that did this, they didn't know they did it. This was basically a news release was released just thereafter by the office that directed the whole operation. The other ones came up with that 35%. The committee never fully justified that 35% number. But I think you get the drift of my point. Setting that upper limit 35% as recently as 2002, That's sort of, what's that telling us? That's sending out a signal to school lunch programs. It's sending out a signal to everyone across the land. It's got in the New York Times, got every place, CNN, et cetera. Well, it's been safe to eat protein. What the signal they're sending is eat all the protein you want. And by the way, once you eat a high quality animal protein. So this problem, this belief system we have, in protein is really warped. It's wrong. And so I just basically describe this increase here to mob power. It happens to be, I never would have said this during my career. I didn't talk. I mean, the vast majority of scientists are very fine people, very honest, but we tend to work in these paradigms and not realizing we don't know what we don't know. And so we get together and get, carried away with the idea that animal protein is so important. And usually we sometimes have associations with industry. I haven't make cautions to think that way. I mean, just remind you here, why is 35%? Why do we have 35, need to have 35% when 10% is enough, especially provided by plant-based diet? So it turned out, the question you might ask, I certainly did, who's funding this group who first decided that 35% is a good number? It turned out the funding for support for that Institute of Medicine, this is of the National Academy of Science, it's a very distinguished, academy essentially. It's the agency within that academy that works on nutrition. But in any case, some folks got around to, wanted to help them out. Here they are. This is a big dairy industry, one of the biggest dairy groups in the world. International Life Sciences Institute, that's supporting the food industry. There's a bunch of corporate organizations, corporations, if you will, probably want to hide their money, call it corporate donors fund. Roche Vitamins, Me Johnson, Mars, my God. And then I threw in another here, the academic charlatans and buffoons. It turns out the director of the institute that did that news release to say it was 35%, that director at the same time was also the chairman of the Dietary Guidelines Committee who gets this information, turns it into the guidelines. One person. I have known him really, really, really well. More than a first name basis. I won't use it publicly here in a moment, but I just happen to know that he's heavily invested in the interests of the dairy industry, among others. And somehow he can carry that flag around, as he joins organizations in the government to help them do it. And he's not the only one. There's a whole cluster of people sort of think this way. Let me summarize quickly. Holistic nutrition. Nutrition to me it's not about single nutrients. Forget it. That's another talk. When people talk about, oh, I took this vitamin, I took that, that's not nutrition. That's a pharmacological interpretation of nutrition, because when they take nutrients out of the food, the whole food context, it has a different effect off the time. It has only no effect, and it has effects sometimes even worse. It's the reverse. So I'm talking about whole food. This is where the nutrition is. It's not from single nutrients here and there. It's whole food. And what distinguishes this whole food idea is that I call it holistic nutrition. Multiple nutrients are at play, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands. I don't know, nutrient-like substances. There's no end to the possibilities. Multiple mechanisms for each nutrient, multiple diseases, all responding the same way. Not just heart disease or cancer, diabetes, it's the whole thing that just, we can call it health if you like, multiple health improvements. So and with all that complexity, which is fascinating, and I have another lecture, a couple lectures on that idea, why that's so, I come down with a really simple idea. I've always been interested in, complexity is one thing. And for those of us who are crazy enough to get into work in the details of this sort of thing, it's fascinating, it's a lot of fun. On one hand, but at the end of the day, we have to end up with something that's simple to remember and use. And here's my recommendations. There's two parts to it. Eat the food in whole food form as much as possible. End of story. Whole food. And as they say, that's a separate lecture. And then keep it plant-based. Plant-based. That's avoiding animal food indirectly way of saying that. By the way, I came up with the term plant-based myself in the late 1970s. And it was just an offhand kind of comment. I was on a committee of cancer research for the National Institutes of of health at the time, and they wanted to sort of give them a little short course on nutrition. They were all quite cancer researchers, and I came up with that word in order to avoid the word vegetarian. Vegetarian, great motivation. It's fine. I don't have any problem with that whatsoever. That's fine, and veganism to follow. It's just the fact that that is the only way to try to sell this message to the world. We're not going to get very far. I have to be very blunt about that. I've had a lot of experience in policy around the world. That is something there obviously a small group of people become fascinated with it, make all the decisions on that basis. But in a larger context, we have a much larger world to work in. So I came up with the word plant-based to try to avoid that. And so, it's been some years, but I see now the word plant-based is kind of getting around. China study, I think many of you know that. It did far better than I ever thought it would. It came out in 2005. I published it with my son, who's now a physician doing some of this kind of work at the University of Rochester Medical Center. But in any case, came out at the time. I didn't know what's going to happen with it. It turned out to be quite good. It's now been translated into 50 foreign languages, and at least 3 million copies have sold going around the world. And then there's a second one, book called Whole. You may know that book too. It goes with the other lecture I said I was going to talk about. That was a New York Times bestseller. And then this one is just published a year ago with, of all people, my grandson was a good writer. And so this is it's taken off now, and I'm kind of excited about it. It's all about what we look at in the future. Now, I did this. I said I was going to say thank you at this point, but I see got a little more time if I can take it. I want to show you something else in 5 minutes if I can, if I thought I had the time. And I can't get into the details. So it's just pique your interest a little bit. What I'm saying here, when we published the China study in 2005, I got fascinated with the idea of whole food plant-based diet. Can do does a lot of good things. It prevents and suspends and cures a lot of diseases. And I went back in the literature to see if any evidence of this sort of thing existed prior to writing that book, 2002, if you will. And I found a bunch of papers. They kind of made reference to these things here. They didn't know. The researchers didn't carry it very far, but they looked at it in a very narrow sense. All these diseases are kind of interesting. They all respond in this way, in a good way. So the whole food plant-based diet is broad, very rapid. Many of you may know this. We can take heart disease. My colleagues, Dr. Esselton, McDougall, Ornish, many others. If you take people who are sick, give them this diet, just like that, in a matter of 2 or 3 days, they start to see major changes. Cholesterol drops, blood sugar drops, so forth. So it's very fast. And finally, one really big thought here about selling this idea to our colleagues around the world. This is not about prevention of disease. We got to stop talking about that. That worked, yes, but there's something I'm going to suggest that's even more exciting. That is called treatment. In other words, thanks to, as I say, my colleagues in heart disease and some others, we did the same thing, that turning cancer on and off in experimental sense. These changes occur fast. They occur fast. Change the diet, and we get responsive very quickly. One thing is missing from that list that I did in 2005 is viral diseases like these. You've heard of these. We've had some serious virus diseases. I always posed the question, whether this applies to 2019. So I went back, looked at some of the data we had collected, and the second time we did the China study in 1989. And we had access to some data on a lot of different diseases, some of them viral diseases, one of which is liver cancer caused by hepatitis B virus, right? This virus here is the most serious virus in the world, has been for quite a long time. It kills about 800,000 people a year, liver cancer. I think that's pretty serious. Now, I just want to show you schematically something about these viruses. They all work this way. The virus is out in the community, okay? It comes and lands on us. We get tested positive. We don't show any symptoms yet, asymptomatic, right? That virus at that point in time, when it gets into our bodies, it can go either one of two ways. Either our body can respond to it, our immune system can respond to it and form some antibodies, okay? And we might be home free. We don't, under those circumstances, we become immunized, and they call it innate immunity, some people, or it can go and do its dirty work. In this case, it's liver cancer. Pretty serious. And just as I say, these are data from our work in China, the second study, about 9,000 people. So let me show you what we saw. Okay, using the same scheme. As I said, about almost 9,000 adults. I'm just repeating the scheme here. The infection is out here in the environment someplace, comes in, lands on us. Now it's an active virus that can do its dirty work. We call it antigen. We measured antigen, viral antigen in those, all these people up here. We measured viral antigen. This is, mind you, 1989. It turns out, okay, if these people just form antigen and they don't get rid of the, don't inactivate it, they're going to get liver cancer, they're going to die. It turned out people who ate a little bit of animal food, and even surprisingly small amount, on average, only about 10% of the level we do in the West. This is world China. People consume only about, on average, around 10% of the total protein as animal protein. They're the ones who got liver cancer. They're the ones that retained the antigen, the active virus. They were in trouble. Just even that small amount of animal food did that. And also something else too. Those who ate the animal protein, we then did some studies on rats, and we won't get a chance to get into that. We found that the animal protein decreases natural killer cells, T cells, people call them these days. This has been a big topic of conversation just in the last few months to find a drug to elevate, natural killer cells, because they're good things. Well, we measured this 30 years ago. Animal protein decrease, and that's the problem. Change the diet. We don't do a drug route. So the alternative to all of that is that we have the active virus in our blood. If we consume plant food, that the people in China who consume more plant food, they formed antibodies. Lo and behold, look at that, strikingly different. Animal food that way, not much. Animal food, plant food this way. That's what we see. That's what I suggested this is, could be related to the virus, to the coronavirus. I sent it for publication. The first time this ever happened in my life, 2 journalists said they wouldn't even review it. They wouldn't even review it. I've never seen anything quite like this. So we are living in a, quite frankly, a hellhole in many ways, as far as what this whole pandemic has done to our thinking, if I might add. And in any case, what we obtained these results based on 11 risk factor correlations, all significant to that level of probability for those who are familiar with it. And the interesting thing about it is people worry about correlation, not causation. That's not true if we're talking about something in larger context. In any case, 11 risk factors, all with this highly significant degree of statistical significance, all of them converging to the same outcome.
Dr. Campbell?
Yeah.
We are just about finished with the time slot, so you have any closing remarks?
I can't hear you.
Just about finished with the time slot. So do you have any closing remarks?
No, there's too much echo there, so I'm not hearing what you're saying. I'm finished here. This is about the last slide. Anyhow, let me just go in. I'll shut it right off. So the coronavirus, there's a reference date for coronavirus. Anyhow, we now have had the publication of our own plus 3 more have occurred, showing, in fact, if we eat the same kind of diet that prevents heart disease and cancer, is the same kind of diet that would also work on coronavirus itself. I will quit there and say thank you. Sorry, I didn't understand what you said. I hope that this will help you get you out of trouble, and so we'll take it from there. Okay, thank you.